What is going on? Welcome back to Jiu-Jitsu Outlet. I'm sitting here in the Jiu-Jitsu Outlet headquarters here in Houston, Missouri, where we are now open for martial arts class. So I've been thinking a lot lately as I've started to become a coach the last couple of weeks. So I've been thinking a lot about the lessons that I've gotten from different martial arts teachers throughout the 13 years that I've been training. I wanted to make a video breaking down some of the top takeaways that I've had from my martial arts teachers over the last 13 years. So I started training in Judo under Edwin Takamori back when I was 7 years old, my very first Judo coach. And Edwin and his brother, they had a gym out, I think it was at the YMCA in Columbia, Maryland. And there was a group of us that would go and train there every once in a blue, or I think a couple times a week, but it wasn't like academy. I think it was just like a program at the YMCA. And my dad is a black belt in judo, so he wanted to take me when I was a little kid. And I only did it for a couple of months, but that was my very first time ever being coached. And I remember learning the seoi-nage throw, the shoulder throw, the osotogari leg reap, and also a few other little things like how I think some of the basics of how to fall. But those were like the only two things that I remember learning was the seoi-nage and the osotogari. And I remember it very well because I remember getting thrown a lot. And I remember thinking that it really hurt. And that was one of my first lessons from Takamori, was that this was the lesson that I took from him, was that he didn't ever go easy on us, even though we were just little kids and this was just like the YMCA. The training was really tough. I remember, at least, from my 7-year-old perspective, I'd done other sports before, and I remember thinking like, wow, this is really like physically painful, hitting the mat and stuff like that. And I remember one time we did a randori session with him, and he had us all line up, and he was just going to throw every single kid, basically. But it was for real. Like, we were supposed to be trying to, throw him and whatnot. So he had us all line up, and he was teaching, and he would just have us run at him and try to have randori. And then once he threw us, then he just would send us to the end of the line, and the next kid would go. So he literally would have kids. It was kind of funny in retrospect, but just imagine like judo master, from Japan, and a bunch of kids, like 5 to 8, lined up, just freaking running at this dude. And with every kid that comes at him, he would just like toss. It was like he was literally, but he would be like telling us to run, So he would have us run at him and then try to spar, and we get thrown like immediately and then run to the back of the line. And it was just like a whirlwind of little kids running at this guy. And I remember that it really hurt. I remember he would throw me, and I remember thinking like, ow, that really freaking hurt. And I think about that a lot, how he didn't take it easy on us just because we were kids or whatever. And I'm not saying that if you're a teacher, you should beat up all the kids, but that's what and not say that that's what I do, but he was really tough on us. And that was really something that I learned from a lot of the judo coaches that I had. Judo is very different than jiu-jitsu, and that's something that you learn, like if you go train at a judo school. It's not as chill, it's not as relaxed, and usually the training is a lot more intense, and it's a lot more conditioning, and there's a lot more kind of like a exercise element to it, if that makes sense. But yeah, I remember those first judo sessions when I was a kid. That was like my big takeaway, was like, this man is not taking it easy on us, even though we're just a bunch of little kids. And it was like, I knew that I was a little kid, and somehow, for some reason, I think maybe it was other sports that I had done, they had never like pushed us as hard, but he would really push us, and he was really tough, and he's a really good coach. He's now the coach at, I believe, the Naval Academy, and the Naval Academy team is incredible at judo. So that guy, really, I wish that I had gotten to train with him more, because I only trained with him when I was a little kid. But he was technically my first martial arts teacher ever. Next teacher was when I was 15, Mr. John Anderson. He was an 8th degree judo black belt that I trained with when I was a kid. And I started training with him, I think, when I was 15. And I didn't go super frequently. And again, big regret, because he was a true master, and he's passed away now. Rest in peace, Mr. Anderson. but he was a real legend in the East Coast judo community. Like, he was one of the OGs of judo in the Baltimore, Maryland area and all up and down the East Coast. And he had a club called Baltimore Judo Club where I really first started training and really first got into this stuff. So one of the biggest takeaways that I had from training with him was he would tell us that judo is like dancing and that martial arts has a lot in common with dancing. And he was all about using technique over strength. And he was a very little guy. Like, when you saw him, he was probably like 5'6" or 5'7". He's shorter, really short guy. He was a head or about he would come up to like my shoulders, and he would look very small. Like, he was an older guy. I think I met him and he was like 85 when I met him. And he would just throw you though like nothing. And he was very fit and he was very nimble and he was very light on his feet and he was all about technique. And that's just really where he started me, was like just telling us so often just about how everything was technique. You're not supposed to use any strength. The whole game is like a dance. And he would tell us that often. Like, I remember multiple classes where he would compare judo to dancing, and he would talk about how his wife made him take up square dancing as a pastime, and at first he didn't want to do it, but then he realized that this actually had a lot in common with martial arts, and he would talk very literally about it. Like, he would teach us some different dance positions and then show like how just as you lead your partner in a dance, you have to lead your opponent into the different traps that you're trying to set, or into the different kazushi or off balancing motions for the different throws. And he would tell us about how like judo doesn't even work unless you are leading your opponent in the same way that you would lead a dance partner. So that was something I've really tried to think about a lot. Another thing that I think about a lot with Sensei Anderson, Mr. Sage is here behind me, chilling on the mats. Sage, we don't need cat hair on the mats. He would tell this story often too about how he went and got his bones looked at, and the doctor didn't understand how his bones were as thick as they had become. And he said that the only explanation that the doctor had was that he had been training in judo for his whole life, and he had been doing break falls like constantly, and he was doing a lot of falls on on the mats all the time and getting thrown and doing judo ever since he was a kid. And apparently his bones had grown to like 4 times the thickness of most people his age. And the doctor was like baffled at how his bones had literally, because usually as people get older, their bones shrink, but John Anderson's bones, I guess, had enlarged actually. So even though he looked he looked skinny, if you put your hands on him and he got a hold of you, you would see like he was super strong, and he had kind of like this freakish old man strength. And apparently he attributed it all to how his bones had grown. So that's obviously anecdotal and only one story, but I've never heard of that from anyone else. But I guess that is what a lifetime of the martial arts can do for you, is literally cause your bones to start growing over time. Take your break falls seriously, everyone, because you might just be growing a larger skeleton as a result. I also trained for a time after John Anderson stopped teaching at the Baltimore Judo Club. It passed on to some of his students. And Tomas was one of the students. I forget what Tomas's last name is. I'll have to look that up somewhere. But Tomas was from Lithuania, and he was just a freaking savage. Like, he was so good at judo, and he was also really good at sambo. And he took over coaching after John Anderson retired from coaching. And he was just a freaking savage. Like, this was a guy who had been training with John Anderson for most of his like judo career in the U.S. And he had been training in sambo and in judo his whole childhood. And he also did a lot of wrestling. So he was just like a really well-versed grappler. I think he was also a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. I remember one time he came to jiu-jitsu class and he leg locked everyone. And I thought that was really interesting. But I trained with Tomas for a number of years. I think like over the course of maybe 4 or 5 years. Like, I trained with him pretty off and on. But then for about a 2-year period, he was like the head coach that I had for judo. And it might have been a little less, maybe like a year and a half. But I got to train with him pretty intensely in that time. And I remember he taught me a lot of like really dirty moves, like a lot of really effective stuff, like the hockey jersey, for example, where you grab the person's gi from behind them and you pull the gi over the top of their head. And he would like pin me in turtle with my gi top. So he would grab my gi. It's kind of in jiu-jitsu, it's kind of considered like a dirty move, but in judo, he never had any ethical problem with doing it to me. But he would grab the back of my gi and like use it to pull over my head so I couldn't see, and he'd pin me there and stuff. And he was just a real savage, honestly. And that was one of my big takeaways from him, was just like that you have to be really tough, that you have to be a real savage, honestly, especially if you're going to be teaching. And that's something that he told me once, was he said that he felt like he had an extra responsibility to be extra good because he was the coach, and he didn't want anyone to ever think that they were learning from someone who they were better than, or something like that. And he said that he felt this responsibility basically to be really good and to be better than the people he was teaching. And I thought that was really interesting, but also it made a lot of sense. Like, of course you're going to want to learn from someone who is better than you. And he was just honestly like a real savage. And the thing that really stood out to me about him was, again, he didn't look like it. Like if you saw him just walking around, he was just the super nicest guy. Always had a big smile on his face. I think he played like folk music in a band. And just looked very unassuming, like not a jacked bodybuilder or anything like that. So that was one of the big takeaways I had from him too, was that you didn't have to look like a shredded athlete to be a monster. Like I would watch this guy just absolutely destroy every single person, and me obviously too, and just not even break a sweat, and then go and like climb the rope after practice and hit a bunch of pull-ups. And like he was just a monster. And I was legitimately terrified of randori with him or sparring with him, because he was so tough. And but it made me stronger. Like it made me a lot tougher, and it really kind of gave me that like initiation into the martial arts, because he was really, really good, and he would just have no problem throwing me on my face and hockey jerseying me with my own gi and just sitting on me, and taught me to be tough for sure. So while I was editing this video, I realized that it was way too long, and I'm going to actually splice this up and make it into multiple different clips. And I'm probably going to end up doing a whole little series on this topic of what I learned from all my martial arts teachers over the last 13 years. So if you want to see the next video, make sure you subscribe to the channel and watch out for that next part, because I've already got part of it done, so I'll be releasing it pretty soon. So thanks for watching, and I hope that you learned something from this.